Hello and welcome. It's been a week where Paris has been at the heart of diplomatic efforts to resolve what's become known as the Forgotten War. The conflict in Sudan, the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, but barely features across much of the media. We'll look at why.
We are homeless. People lost their jobs. They aren't able to afford food and drink.
It's been a week where the clandestine war between Israel and Iran came out of the shadows with direct attacks on each other's territory. We'll ask where this could go next.
The sound heard early in the morning in Isfahan was not an explosion. It was our powerful air defense firing at a suspicious object. It caused no damage or incident at all.
And in the US, it was a week the unprecedented became a precedent as a former president faced criminal charges. And at jury selection week in New York, it's been a challenge finding anyone impartial.
And it's very unfair, very bad thing. Very bad thing. The whole world is watching this hoax.
Joining me from the International Press Corps this week, Victor Mallet, award-winning foreign correspondent, now senior editor at the Financial Times, author of River of Life, River of Death, the Ganges and India's Future, useful when we talk about the elections, and seasoned international news reporter, editor, France 24, Lila Jacinto. And let's move across live to Istanbul. The Pulitzer Prize-nominated journalist Barsu Daragaha, who worked for The Independent, amongst other outlets. Great to have you all on board. Let's look, first of all, at how a conflict that is taking place right now, and that's regarded as one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world, has become known as the Forgotten War. Aid agencies say after exactly a year of civil war in Sudan, driven by a fight for power between two military factions, the world's turned away. The UN estimates at least 14,000 Sudanese civilians have died, 8 million displaced, 4 million of them children, and 18 million facing acute hunger.
Our duty was to make it clear that we are not forgetting what is happening in Sudan, that we remain mobilised and there are no double standards.
Well, that was Emmanuel Macron, the president. This week in Paris, an international fundraising summit held. The idea was to raise, well, more than they had, because $2 billion was the sum total for humanitarian aid. Aid agencies say they need around double that. Before the summit, Save the Children's Arif Noor contrasted the lack of international donations with the world's response to the Notre Dame Cathedral fire, saying this: "It is a staggering situation that after a fire where nobody died, donors across the world were so moved to pledge funds to restore Notre Dame." Victor, let's start with you. Do you agree that the Sudan war has become the forgotten conflict?
Yes, I think it has. I mean, it's desperately sad and desperately, the hunger and the amount of internally displaced people, essentially refugees in their own country, is staggering. We're talking about millions of people. Half the population are at risk. Many of them at risk from hunger and famine and starvation. And I'm afraid it's because it just doesn't have the same. The same world powers involved that we all sort of identify with or identify against. And there is that problem that, because the Americans are not involved and the Israelis are not involved and the Chinese are not involved and it's not Russia versus Ukraine, people are letting it, pass them by in terms of the attention that they're focusing on it. It is a kind of civil war, and there are international actors involved, but they're countries that nobody feels that strongly about, like the UAE, for example, which is accused of supporting one side. Saudi Arabia has been involved in, and the US have been trying to make peace early on in the conflict. But essentially, we have allowed this to get out of control, and it's very hard to know. I mean, one of the problems with the aid that has been pledged, finally, more than $2 billion has been pledged. But the problem is now not the money; it's whether you can get the aid into the country, given the kind of rebel and military factions that are fighting it out on the ground and committing really terrible human rights abuses, including particularly in Darfur, where they did the same thing many years ago.
Back in 2003,
Yeah.
You were talking about a situation where two military factions, the Rapid Support Force, which are an origin of what they call the Janjaweed, aka roughly translated the devils on horseback, back in Darfur, accused of genocide there, taking on the military, and this has been going on a year, and something personal to you as well, Victor, somewhere you spent time as a child.
Yeah, well, I lived there as a child. I went to school in England, but I lived there, and my parents lived there. And we of course loved Sudan, and we were very lucky to be living there in a brief moment of peace when the war between southern Sudan and the rest of the country, the civil war as it was then, South Sudan is now independent, there was a kind of a period of peace, and that meant we could travel all over the country, including what is now South Sudan, and that was wonderful. And of course now it's just deteriorated, steadily into this really awful situation that we're now in, and we hear Sudanese people, talking to the BBC and yourselves from exile, essentially, in Egypt or London or the Arab world, the Gulf states. It's a really, really tragic situation. And of course, the leaders of the two, factions that are fighting it out used to be together in running a sort of military government. So it's a pretty unsavory situation. And there's maybe you have a solution, but it's hard to imagine one.
No pressure, Leela.
No, I don't have a solution because, as you say, these were two generals, two military men who were together against a civilian government. But, I was covering this. And I think with Sudan, a couple of things. One is, as Victor pointed out, very troubled history, a history of violence. That's one. Two, even in the process when the civilian government was trying to get its act together, and I knew people, who were part of this process, who were working with now former Prime Minister Hamdok, it was very difficult to establish the way forward. The classic problems of post-conflict situations. How many of the people of the old party can you include? How many are considered traitors, etc. But to your point of not getting coverage, there was a time not so long ago when Sudan was getting coverage, and that was in 2019, when sort of the narrative was hopeful. Do you remember the woman, the Kandaka, the woman in the stove with sneakers? That really captured the imagination.
It was a sort of democratic spring, wasn't it? Which did draw everyone's attention. And you're right, maybe people are excited by hopeful stories.
To which it is exactly 5 years to the week that we saw the fall of President Omar al-Bashir. After 30 years in charge, protests, lots of hope, including what you said, that dancing in the street, this iconic moment of a transition, and these two people you refer to, the head of the army, the head of the Rapid Support Force, General Hemeti, they were together. They were leading this transition, and they overthrew the transition. I want to put something to you, Basu. I want to put to you what we've heard here. This is the view of Yasmin Abdul Magid, a Sudanese journalist and author, on why this is not covered. She says this. She said it's going on in Africa where conflicts are seen as par for the course, less interesting to the international media. It's also a challenge for journalists on the ground because there were 1,100 back in 2022 working in Sudan. Now, according to UNICEF, she says 90% of those journalists are now unemployed. What do you make of that?
There's no coverage because there's literally no coverage, because it's impossible to get access to the conflict zone. Neither side, and I don't put any distinction. Let's be clear. I don't think there's much. One side calls itself an army, another is described as militias, but they're pretty much both just in terms of how they've been behaving, armed thugs. There was a little bit of talk of, is there a solution to this? It seems intractable now, but back in 2019, there were many voices in Sudanese civil society warning the international community that the solution they had come up with, this power-sharing agreement with the civilians eventually set to take power, and the generals, the jackals, let's call them, continuing to retain actual power, was not sustainable, and that essentially power had not changed hands from the time of Bashir's deposition. It was still in the hands of the men with guns. There was a chance then to push the military, push these thugs, essentially what they are, out of power, and the international community took the quick, easy solution.
I want to just mention something to you, Bozo, which is quite complicated, but you might have a view on. So Victor touched upon this a moment ago, the fact that you haven't got necessarily US involvement, but you have got a kind of proxy situation going on with the Rapid Support Force on the one side, gold reserves in Darfur, supported allegedly by the UAE. There's no questions in the United Arab Emirates about gold going there. Tell me, Bozu.
Yeah, I mean, let's not. Yeah, there is international involvement. There is, I mean, the Russians have been involved. They're engaged in this, and they have, to some extent, some responsibility. UAE has backed its side. Look, but I think that at this point, it's gone beyond that. Neither side in the proxy war dimension, they've created this Frankenstein, and now they don't know what to do with it. It's completely destabilizing. It is, if you go to Libya, if you go to Italy, if you go to, the sort of migrant trail, the refugee trail, Sudan is a major source of refugees and displaced people around the world right now, and it long has been. And there was a chance to remedy that situation. And so, I don't think anyone to the extent that there was a proxy war, it's over, and it's kind of a Frankenstein of its own right now.
I saw this incredible tweet this week, or X, I should say, Victor. It was a reporter saying at Istanbul airport, they were witnessing 4 Sudanese men with gold in a bag that were going via Istanbul to Dubai, and probably difficulty with the floods at the moment there, because they don't have any questions asked policy. So that also funds the RSF. And at the same time, we have an odd situation. You referred to Saudi Arabia supporting the military, Iran essentially on the same side at the moment, supporting the military and providing the same drones that we're seeing going across the Red Sea at the moment and across to Israel.
Yeah. And you also had a weird situation at one point where Ukraine and Russia appeared to be fighting a sort of proxy mini-war in Khartoum at one point. I think it was a year or two ago now. So, I mean, the problem is, I think, once you have the loss of all kind of normal institutions and a breakdown of law and order, which he's got now, I mean, all bets are off in terms of what can and can't be done. And the real problem is that the people who suffer are the ordinary people who can't get access to food, can't get access to water. Crops are being devastated where they're even able to be planted. So you just have a kind of it is a totally chaotic situation by all accounts. Very difficult, as Bozu said, to get in and out, whether for journalists or for aid workers and aid suppliers. Yeah.
You mentioned the refugees. 1.8 million Sudanese civilians have left the country. House in packed refugee camp in Chad, Central African Republic, Egypt, Ethiopia, South Sudan. 6.7 million internally displaced inside the country, many packed into Port Sudan, 800 kilometres from Khartoum. Let's hear from some of those refugees who've been talking to reporters about their situation.
We are homeless. People lost their jobs. They aren't able to afford food and drink. Even the shelters are not equipped to house people. We don't have money for medicine.
This war is nonsense. How can a militia have the same capabilities as the army? This is a logical question that we want an answer to. If this militia has reached this level and the army has not been able to confront it, then it's the army's fault. If they're not able to end the war militarily, they should stop the war and declare a truce until a solution is found. But as citizens, we're the ones affected by war.
A brief word from the three of you on whether, there's an answer to that question there, whether a solution is found. Bozu, you first.
I mean, the solution is over, as far as I can tell. I mean, you have to be really on the ground. At this point, to come up with a solution, you would have to have a very granular understanding of what is happening on the ground. And actually, I don't even think the generals themselves are completely understanding what is happening in their own country because of the chaos that they themselves have unleashed.
Lila.
There is no solution. I don't think you're going to find it on the show. But one of the things that struck me is that a lot of Sudanese people are getting, understandably, very tired with the RSF, with Hemedti's forces. But also, what Sudan could face is a sort of an Egypt remake, where if the military, if the general, if Burhan manages to keep control, would he be a sort of a Sisi-like character? And then, once again, you see civilians trapped and sort of seeking the military leader to keep the country together. And this was not what the Sudanese people wanted after the fall of Omar Bashir.
So 2 on the panel, Victor, no solution.
Well, I think it's obviously too early to talk about a political solution. So we have to talk about the immediate, solutions. And it's very hard to see anything except simply preventing foreign powers from providing weapons or support to either of the factions and allowing international aid to get in. And I suppose having the UN, maybe it's something that the UN could actually agree on, and the UN Security Council could do something without any of the countries on it vetoing, the permanent members vetoing it, and to say, look, we need to impose a solution at the UN level. And that means that every country has got to stop supporting militants or any armed factions, really, whether it's the government or the militants. As Bozu said, they're kind of indistinguishable now. And then you can look in the longer term at a longer term political solution and some kind of resolution. But it would be very, very difficult, I agree.
Whatever happens, we will still follow developments. We won't forget it here on France 24. Violent delights have violent ends. Shakespeare wrote Friar Lawrence's advice to Romeo and Juliet to love moderately, else extreme acts have extreme costs. This week, in the midst of escalating conflict in the Middle East, Israel received similar advice in Nature to act moderately from the US, the UK, France, Germany, all urging Israeli restraint in responding to an Iranian missile and drone attack in the early hours of Sunday. That, says Iran, was revenge to Israel striking its consulate in Syria. Fast forward to the early hours of Friday morning. Explosions heard in the central Iranian province of Isfahan. Israel suspected. This is how Iran reacted.
The sound heard early in the morning today in Isfahan was not an explosion. It was our powerful air defense firing at a suspicious object. It caused no damage or incident at all. The air defense and its proud staff are fully prepared to confront any enemy with malicious intentions against Islamic Iran's land or sky.
Bozu, we'll start with you. This is close to you. You were born in Iran. What do you make of the latest strikes and where things stand?
I mean, I think in a way, in the short term, it's kind of good news for people living in the region. It showed a measure of restraint on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu's government. According to Iran, it was no big deal. According to Israel, they say not a word. According to the U.S., there was an attack. The details of it have not yet come out. But it shows that, that there is an attempt on the part of Israel to go back into the shadow war mode and not escalate any further. However, knowing how Israel operates, I think that they will want revenge. This was a scary attack on Israel. It was really the first time a nation fired missiles at Israel since the 1991 Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein fired Scud missiles. So this was unprecedented. It spooked people in Israel. It spooked people in the region. It sent markets reeling. Thankfully, for most investors, it took place on a Sunday. If it had taken place on a market day, it would have had even more impact. Iran made its point. There was not a lot of damage. Only one civilian injured in a kind of shrapnel incident. So it was a scary moment. But for now, at least, the region has stepped back from the precipice.
Victor, you've covered many difficult situations in many places. Do you think that was it?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, clearly both attacks were calibrated. Even the Iranian attack, which was very substantial with more than 300 missiles and drones, was well signaled in advance so that the Israelis would know. It didn't seem to target civilian areas. It seemed to target mostly remote areas of Israel.
Iran telling its neighbours.
Military bases. Yes, I mean, this was very much a very sort of calibrated, careful approach, and the Israeli response has been the same. They kind of pretty much signaled it in advance, and they don't appear to have loosed off many missiles, maybe only even one. We're not quite sure at this stage exactly what the Israelis did. So they were both doing a lot of signaling rather than a lot of trying to create a lot of casualties. However, in the last week, they have both gone way beyond the indirect shadow war that you referred to that they were fighting before. So we are in a much more dangerous situation. And it's not impossible that the Israeli attack in the early hours of this morning was a kind of probing attack to see what Iranian air defenses are like, and they might come up with something much bigger in the next few days. We don't know. But the point is, yes, so far the attack's been very calibrated, and that's good news for the Americans and for everybody else. It means that it's not yet gone beyond where it has been, but they have both crossed red lines that were previously in place. You know, the Israelis by attacking the consulate, which was a pretty outrageous act, even though the Israelis would say the consulate was more of a military base in Syria, and the Iranians with a very massive direct missile attack on Israel. And that is taking it up to a new level, which is very, very dangerous. Yeah.
For those thinking that perhaps all even an attack, they used what reportedly quadcopters, types of drones sent within Iran as opposed to Israel, as is reported. And yet you have members on the right of the cabinet, Itamar Ben-Gvir, tweeting, the only official sense of response we've had, if you can call it that, saying, quote, weak. What's your take on that, Leila?
Well, I mean, so many takes on it. First and foremost, as you say, Israel gets away with never confirming its strikes. It does not publicly acknowledge the strike on the embassy in Damascus either. So when we are talking about the perception of double standards, not in the West, outside of the West and in the region, this totally gets exacerbated. On the other hand, when Iran made its strike, it responded in a way that sort of acknowledged international law, right to response, informing people about this attack, then declaring it over. This is not the case with Israel, who has not owned this strike. We have to, we all assume, of course, that this is the case. And then to the central issue of the Iranian-Israeli relations, right? I mean, Israel has been targeting Iranian assets, conducting targeted assassinations as a matter of policy. Last week, last week, we crossed a milestone in terms of this attack. But I mean, all this goes to show that at the end of Biden's term in office, his Middle East policy is an utter, complete failure. Because don't forget that, Barack Obama tried to get Iran on side, not because, Iran is a fantastic player and we love the mullahs, but to sort of make it less of a player, a proxy player, and Biden accepted that. We do not have an Iran nuclear deal, and we see the Iran side of the conflict really taking away attention from what is happening in Gaza right now.
Botu, let me put Leila's points to you. Really interesting about Biden, because there are those, I heard one former ambassador to Barack Obama today saying that actually the issue was Donald Trump, that he unwound lots of the measures about Iran, its nuclear policy, the treaty to keep it away from building nuclear power and becoming a nuclear threat. And that's what did it, or allowed Iran to feel emboldened. What's your take?
I mean, I would just say that one impact of Trump's policy was destroying the kind of domestic liberal reform movement, liberal in the relative sense. Inside Iran, he really discredited them. The abrogation, the canceling of the nuclear deal completely humiliated the reformists in Iran and made it much easier for the hardliners to take power and so on. So I think that was one big major impact that he had. And so right now you have a situation in Iran where the reformers have zero power and zero influence. That has had an impact, I think, on foreign policy, perhaps even more than on domestic policy, but on domestic policy as well. But yeah, that is an interesting thing. One little point I thought that was kind of interesting in the New York Times over the last couple of days, there was a good story about how the Netanyahu and the Israeli cabinet didn't realize that hitting the consulate would have the earth-shattering impact that it did. And I think that's interesting. whether or not it's an accurate story or whether it was a leak, an exercise in messaging toward the Iranians saying, look, we were just trying to, play the shadow war game. We were not trying to bring it up to a new level, and so on. So I think that was very interesting, that perhaps this was a miscalculation on the part of Netanyahu, or at least after the fact, they wanted to depict it as a miscalculation because they're not interested in escalating the war with Iran either.
Victor, we're not talking tonight about the situation in Gaza. Much of the journalistic attention worldwide is on what's going on, this back and forth. Now, what do you think that does to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister's position right now? As a respite to some degree? Where does it put him?
Yeah, I think this is a problem for the rest of the world, is that Iran's attack on Israel has done exactly that, has distracted attention from the situation in Gaza, which is to Netanyahu's advantage and is not to the advantage of the Palestinians or to the American attempt to get the Israelis to tone down their activities in Gaza and to get Hamas and Israel to reach some kind of ceasefire agreement. So yeah, it's a problem, and it's one of these sort of laws of unintended consequences, I guess, that you have. The Iranians probably weren't thinking about that because they were thinking about their own confrontation with Israel, but that is one of the effects. In the same way that Trump's reneging on the Iran nuclear deal didn't just finish the chances of reformers inside Iran, which is obviously not something that the Americans would want or be in favor of. It also allowed the Iranians to accelerate their nuclear weapons programs, or their potential nuclear weapons programs, which is an incredibly bad thing for America's allies and for America and for Israel and for the whole Middle East. So this is when you take these kind of actions, they have consequences which in Trump's case, he probably didn't even think about it, didn't realize it. But in the case of Iran attacking Israel, they probably weren't thinking about how this would distract attention from. Well, meaning that the people would sort of forget for a moment about Gaza and start looking about the threat of an Iran-Israel war. Yeah.
Which moves us on to, the start of the week, Monday, 15th of April, 9:25, New York. This happened. It is a first in the US in history, an ex-president heading into court for a criminal trial. One of 4 this year for Donald Trump. He's made clear he hasn't been enjoying the week so far.
And I'm sitting here for days now, from morning till night, in that freezing room, freezing. Everybody was freezing in there. And it's very unfair, very bad thing. Very bad thing. The whole world is watching this hoax.
Everybody's freezing, he says. Well, this case is about an alleged affair, 2016, with the ex-porn star, Stormy Daniels, who says she was paid $130,000 hush money, although buying her silence isn't the alleged crime. But whether or not he covered up those payments as, quote, legal fees in business documents, so as not to harm his 2016 election campaign. Jury selection this week. It's been a challenge selecting 12 fair and independent jurists, plus reserves who aren't biased for or against such a divisive figure. Here's one of dozens dismissed by the judge, or bounced, as they call it. This is Cara McGee.
It was wild. It was. I really wish that I didn't have such a scheduling thing, because history is being made regardless of how it goes. It's just such a fascinating thing. It's like, oh, here's this person who you've followed on the campaign news.
So the juror said she had work issues. Leela, not just a precedent for a former president, but also if you're on the jury deciding whether or not that former president is a criminal.
Honestly, Gavin, I really don't have the bandwidth for this. Here we are, talking about selecting juries. I remember the first trial that I covered in the US was the O.J. Simpson trial. If this was happening in any other country, we would be lecturing them about their justice system. Now they have a jury selection process that comes from Middle England common law. We just accept this because it is the superpower. It's the conservative country. It cannot change. And we have to spend time on how are they going to get 12 people who, don't have an opinion about Trump? And, we're stuck in this circus covering the issues that are really not that important.
For you, you'd want to see a judge. Simple as that. No jury.
I mean, we've heard time and again about the problems about the justice system, and this is a story when we get a verdict. People have lost track of what are the criminal cases, the non-criminal cases. We haven't even started the campaign of a superpower. So I'm done. Victor, do you have a point of view?
Jury or no jury, Victor?
Well,
would you sit on it?
I mean, of course, as the woman said, the juror who couldn't make it. I mean, you'd be there making history. No, I mean, I agree. It's clearly a circus. It's clearly absurd, and clearly.
But there's a distinction. Can you, as Leela said, you might have a view on Trump, but can you still take that away and say, well, hang on a minute, I am independent of thought.
I was trying to remember what's it called? 12 Angry Men, the movie.
A Few Good Men.
The movie about the
12
1960s.
Apostles.
No, it's called something
12
like
Angry Men,
12 Angry Men, I think.
so,
Yeah,
yes.
it's a really good movie because they all sort of have a preconceived of opinion who's guilty, but in the end, of course, the negotiation that goes on behind the scenes in the jury room is like they actually persuade them. No, you can't vote according to your identity beliefs, your belief that this man is wrong because he's somebody you don't like. You've actually got to look at the evidence, and so that was quite fun. And one hopes that kind of thing would happen in this case, but of course one doesn't really know. It seems to me the problem is that even the judges. I mean, we now know in America from the Supreme Court that judges are not apolitical; they're highly political, and the whole American justice system is, it's politicized in the sense that you get elected. Or you get chosen for the Supreme Court by the president because of your political beliefs, which is just extraordinary in any other country. I mean, at least in another country, you would try to hide the fact that this was a political appointment, even if it was underlying everything a political appointment. But in America, they're quite open about it. I'm going to vote for this guy because he has the same views on me as abortion, or I'm going to choose this person as a because he favors the rich. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that the whole system is so messed up. But yeah, and it is theatre. But at the same time, one wants to see somebody who's accused of a crime tried like anybody else. I mean, the fact that he's former president really shouldn't make a difference. And of course, the only reason there's this theatre is because he is the former president.
Borzu, President Trump said the world is watching. Is that the case? Are people watching in Istanbul and Ankara and Turkey? Is it a common thread of conversation? No? No,
and I think even the Americans are kind of sick to death of this to some extent. It's not getting the ratings it was back in 2015, 16. But look, I want to, as the sole American on this panel here, I want to defend.
I'm an American.
It's half and half.
The jury process. Oftentimes, more often than you believe, these jurors rise to the occasion. They put aside their opinions, and instructed by a competent, even if politically appointed judge, they follow the evidence and so on. So it happens very frequently, far more frequently than you might believe, where the jurors kind of do the right thing and look at the evidence, look at the law, and make a decision based on that. And there are safeguards against politicization of jury verdicts in these sort of cases. The judge and the defense and other monitoring kind of entities can throw out a verdict if it looks like it was biased or politically motivated or not rooted in a reasonable interpretation of the evidence and the law.
But this matters, Leela. I know your sense of the jury, yes or no, but ultimately this came 2016 before he was elected. At a time where he was going around, he was caught on the Access America saying grab women by the genitals. If this had have come out, if this was disclosed as a hush money payment, that could have potentially, according to the attorneys, wrecked Trump's career.
Well, I mean, there's the term Teflon Trump, and all these allegations of his language with women, etc. It emerged before the 2016 election, and it did not affect his electability among his female supporters.
He's also conservative supporters having an affair on his alleged affair on his wife. It's whether that would sway them differently to comments.
Well, I mean, if you look at his supporters, they believe Trump when he says that he is being targeted, that it is a witch hunt, which goes right back to the issue of how does a president win an election in the U.S. not with the majority of people voting for them? They have an archaic electoral college system. I am an American. I am an immigrant, and when I landed in the U.S., I just said, this is a load of bullshit. And I had a lot of Americans explaining the system to me like I don't understand. They seem incapable of seeing their creaky government system needs a change. I mean, France would just throw away this constitution and have a new one.
Right. One thing that we may have different opinions on, and one of the bigger issues of the week, did Donald Trump fall asleep? They're calling him the Nod Father, Sleepy Don. His supporters say he was, quote, fighting sleep like an action hero would fight crime. This is an account from Maggie Haberman. We might be able to get it. This is covering the case for the New York Times. Can we see Maggie's account? No, essentially she was in the courtroom. She said his head didn't loll back, but he didn't notice the court papers going past him. Once she tweeted that she said he fell asleep, she claims that he stared at her for a good 5 minutes solid. So, Sleepy Don?
I don't know. I didn't see the footage in great detail. I did see the pictures. But it's funny that he was saying it was very cold, because when it's very cold, you tend not to fall asleep. But maybe the day before or the first day, maybe it was very hot. Maybe that's why he fell asleep. I don't know.
Or maybe it was just plain boring.
Yeah. Bozu, the final word on this, on Trump for you. Do you care if he fell asleep? Was he asleep? What's the final juror opinion on this?
I swear I've not been paying attention at all. At all. And like Leela, I will wait for the verdict. I think that is significant. The verdict will be significant. The day-to-day is just kind of, we're feeding the beast.
Interesting. Bozu, well, while Donald Trump is in court, the world's biggest election in India, which has just got underway, will be taking place for the next 6 weeks. It involves 968 million eligible Indian voters, more than 2,500 political parties, perhaps one likely result, a third term for the Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The question is, amongst some analysts, not how he'll win, but how much by. Latest approval ratings make him the most popular leader in the world right now. Bollywood stars would envy his popularity score of more than 75%. Leela, something you've followed closely. Modi, the yogi, defender of the everyman, the Hindu faith. Explain the popularity, one that's not universal.
Well, it's an extraordinary personality cult. To be fair, India has always had a penchant for sycophancy. The previous Prime Minister, Indira, was India. So there is that. But the Modi personality cult has taken it to an extraordinary degree. I liked the strap that you have, is Modi win over guaranteed, because I was actually looking at his party's manifesto. And the party manifesto is called Modi Guarantees. And every single chapter is, Modi guarantees on fisheries, Modi guarantee on farming, Modi guarantee on youth. You see Modi everywhere. And the difference between, the old personality figures, first and foremost, they were not on the level that it was. The Modi personality cult comes with a sort of a whip. So among his followers, he is seen, almost as a godman. So if you do not agree with that, it has a whiff of blasphemy. His Hindu nationalism is a hyper-nationalism. So a criticism of Modi is tantamount to treason. So there is the pull factor and a very dangerous push factor. So this is also fed, of course, by the media, which is there is an independent media. It's not the mainstream media. It's not the TV channels that, most people are watching. I don't want to, there are journalists doing some pretty good job in very difficult circumstances, but overwhelmingly, the Indian media, propagates this cult.
The problem is that the media that doesn't propagate the cult, the independent media you were talking about, they have been very heavily suppressed by Modi, as have independent academics, NGOs, civil society in general, and the opposition parties.
Totally.
So, yeah.
And the way it is done, should be interesting for a Financial Times journalist. It's done financially. So critics are hit by these corruption charges. They get arrested by the Enforcement Directorate. That's a very
So in the
powerful...
case of the main opposition party, the Congress Party, what was the figure? Something like 200,000 or even more? Was it 2 million that they were... suppressed their
Well, they
banks
closed their bank accounts, so they couldn't campaign because they closed their bank accounts over a tax.
To which the BJP said it was a tax anomaly. They said you've stopped funds.
Yeah.
Interesting, Layla's point as well about how they take a theme. Like Modi guarantees, Modi guarantees. It's something we're seeing elsewhere. If you go to Denmark, Ulf Kristersson, the Prime Minister there, they did something called Rick Rolling. You heard of this? The singer Rick Astley and the song Never Gonna Give You Up. They said Ulf will never give you up, never let you down, never say goodbye, never hurt you. It's funny, but it's catchy. And in some ways, you covered the last elections in India. You have a front row seat of how effective his communication policy has been.
And one of the things that I find baffling is, given, as you said, that he is very likely to win anyway, why does he and the party, the BJP, why do they feel the need to persecute the opposition? They've arrested the chief minister of Delhi, who's from the opposition Aam Aadmi Party. They've made life very difficult for Congress Party, which is one of the the main members of the opposition coalition. Why do they need to target these people with essentially unfair, tax investigations, unfair criminal investigations, which of course are not directed, or very, very rarely directed, at BJP politicians? Why do they need to do that when they're going to win anyway? And it's a classic sort of situation that you tend to see as leaders or states become more authoritarian. They have this kind of desire to have it all. They're not happy with just winning an election fair and square, even though they are going to do that. They want more. They want sort of absolute, domination and the opposition to be completely out.
Bozu, I want to go to you as well, because I'm just interested as to how this is covered in Turkey and the relationship between Turkey's leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and how he sees Modi.
I mean, I think that's a good question. I think that India does not play such a huge role in Turkey's foreign policy. They have much closer relations with Pakistan and other stands as well. The Central Asia equation is much more important for Turkey. India has not played a role in Turkish foreign policy. India plays a far bigger role and is a far bigger player in Iran and other parts of the Middle East, the Gulf, et cetera, where there are big energy deals. Turkey doesn't have anything that India needs. India doesn't really offer anything that Turkey needs. But India is a much bigger piece. You mean in terms of the populism?
Yeah, no, I was wondering. I think you were asking, whether Modi was emulating Erdogan's style of democratic governance.
Yeah, but I think that the Muslim thing really, because the anti-Muslim thing does not please a lot of Erdogan supporters and Erdogan himself. And also, in general, Turkey is more closely aligned with Pakistan.
Last word, Leela.
Since I cover Turkey and India, the difference is with populists, they have the narrative of victimhood, of course. Erdogan's narrative of victimhood were the believing Muslims, the women who wore scarves, where the Islamists, which was really sidelined by Ataturk's vision of a very hard secular Turkey. Modi has managed to have this idea of Hindu victimhood when there is absolutely no grounds for it. Hindus comprise 80% of the population, but he has somehow, and his party has somehow, worked the narrative of victimhood against a Muslim minority based on, a rich history of Muslim rulers like the Mughals who were very much Indian. So if the narrative doesn't stand the test of actually historical fact.
Leela Jacinto, Bozu Daragahi and Victor Mallet, pleasure to have you all on. We'll see you next week for The World Next Week.